Hey guys, it's Heather from the Renaissance English History Podcast, and welcome to this week's Tudor Minute, your weekly dose of all things related to medieval and Renaissance England. So, today I want to talk to you about rebellions, because I'm working on an episode of Rebellions, which is going to be live by next week, and I'm working on a series of episodes. So in the first episode, we're going to talk about the causes of Tudor rebellions and look at what the main themes were in the rebellions of the Tudor dynasty. And then in the next episode, we're going to look at some specific rebellions and then look at how they were handled and how rebels were punished and how monarchs tried to avoid rebellions. So I'm writing the episode right now on the causes and the overall themes behind the rebellions. And one of the major themes of Tudor rebellions was dynastic succession. And this actually took two forms. So in the early Tudor dynasty with Henry VII, it was about actually changing the monarch. So Henry VII came to the throne after 30 years of civil war that we call the Wars of the Roses. And he beat Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. And we now see that as the definitive end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. But not everybody at the time saw that. So there were still Yorkists who wanted to defeat the new Tudor Lancastrian dynasty. And so Henry VII had a series of rebellions against him, starting right away the year after he won in 1486, when some of Richard III's counselors got together and started a rebellion against him. And then there were later rebellions with pretenders, people who were actually sponsored by other monarchs to come, who pretended that they were related to Edward IV, who was the most popular Yorkist king who lasted the longest. And it's interesting because Edward IV's reign actually was pretty stable for about 10 years before he died unexpectedly. And so for Henry, Henry we can see now that the Tudor dynasty was really stable. But at the time, he had no idea. And so he had some stability, but he kept thinking, what if he died young? What would happen to his family? What would happen to this dynasty that he was trying to build? So interestingly, a lot of the rebellions against Henry VII were actually about changing the dynasty. Whereas later rebellions against Henry VIII and against Elizabeth were not so much about changing the dynasty. Also, the rebellion with Lady Jane Grey was actually about changing the dynasty. But it wasn't completely getting rid of the Tudors. It was just having a Protestant one who was related. It's a different story. I'll talk about that later in the podcast. Listen to the podcast. But anyway, the later rebellions against Henry VIII and against Elizabeth weren't so much about kicking the Tudors out, but they were about changing the succession. So there were actually one of the most famous rebellions against Henry VIII, which is the Pilgrimage of Grace, where a bunch of people in the north rebelled, and that was largely about religion. But one of the things they were asking for was that Mary Tudor, be included in the succession. She had been declared a bastard. She was Henry VIII's child with Catherine of Aragon. And when he divorced Catherine of Aragon, he declared Mary to be a bastard because the marriage wasn't official. And so one of the things that the Pilgrimage of Grace asked for was for Mary to be included back in the succession. And later rebellions, even against Elizabeth, were about changing the succession and having, for example, Mary Queen of Scots be listed as her official heir. And that was kind of about changing the religion to have it so that when a Protestant monarch died, the heir would be Catholic, or when the Catholic monarch died with Wyatt's rebellion against Mary I, that the heir would be a Protestant. So it's just interesting that you don't need to know all these official rebellions right now, because I'm going to talk about them in the podcast. But it's just interesting to note that in early Tudor times, the rebellions were actually about changing the monarch. And in later Tudor times, it wasn't so much about changing the monarch, but about changing the succession. So that's your Tudor rebellion theme for the day. To learn more about the Renaissance English History Podcast, you can go to www.englandcast, E-N-G-L-A-N-D, C-A-S-T, englandcast.com, or you can subscribe on iTunes or your podcast service of choice, Pocket Casts, Podbean, Stitcher, TuneIn, whatever you use, subscribe. Okay, Talk to you later. Bye.